Okay, good morning. It's Sunday, and it's Mother's Day here in the UK, so happy Mother's Day. This is Nick, creator of Hayes Reviews, and we're back with another book to read. And this time, we're reading The Story of the Rockefeller Foundation by Raymond Fosdick. And excuse me, I've left my audio on. Bit of an echo there. I've got a new setup, but I got it. I got on top of it. So it's The Story of the Rockefeller Foundation. And this book was chosen by the members of the Telegram group, and I'm very grateful for those who took part in voting. This was actually up for vote on my previous round of voting, but it lost to the Lusitania and it lost to Bertrand Russell as well. But now that we've got those two books polished off and on the record, we're continuing with the Rockefeller Foundation. And so thank you for being here if you are here, and thank you for checking out this video after the fact if you're watching on the replay. It is very lovely indeed to know that there is an audience out there who want to learn from books. So hello, good morning. I hope you're all doing well. Quick look in the chat. We've got Chi, Peter, and Elizabeth. Thank you all for being back here and taking part and showing up. That's what it's all about, isn't it, when it comes down to it? So I'm really excited to get started on this one today. It's going to be a very interesting book, I think, because we're learning about the Rockefeller Foundation in their own words, or at least the book wasn't written by a member of the Rockefeller family, but someone very close. This gentleman, Raymond B. Fosdick, he was president of the Rockefeller Foundation all through the Second World War. And so he's very close and he knows the ins and outs of it. And he's written this book, and it's one of the books that Richard Grove refers to very often on the Grand Theft World podcast. And it's a key thing to look at what they say about themselves, because of course there'll be some spin, there'll be some omissions. We won't be getting the whole story, but in terms of understanding history and having an accurate or a good comprehension of what are the schemes in place and how did we get to this point in history, it's a great starting point to at least see what they admit to and what they say about themselves, right? We've got LJ in the chat as well. Good morning. Thank you for being here. Any mothers out there, happy Mother's Day to you. You wonderful people. The best, most important job on the planet. You're doing it to the best of your ability, and to that I salute you, and I wish you lots of love and support and encouragement, and I hope you can relax on this day. I will be going to hang out with all the women in my family later on. We're going to eat some pizza, drink some beer, that sort of thing. Andrew T says, important topic. Thanks for what you do. You're very welcome. So I do have a little bit of a sort of preamble to get through before we dive into the book itself. So without any further chin wagging, I'll get on with that. So the first thing I want to mention, and I've been busy this last few days, but if we go over here to the article, you can see this is the live stream. But what I've been doing over the last few days is I've been putting more stuff in the description box below and making sure everything down there is up to date. So now it says, thank you for being here, and explore the links below to support Hayes Reviews. And I've tidied all this up, and I've added lots of new ways to support and new ways to get involved. And so we've still got Instagram and Telegram if you want to connect with me and stay up to date with the announcements, and if you want to have a say in what books we talk about and we read, the Telegram group is a good place to do that. And I think we've got a nice core member group of people who are very enthusiastic about books and very into learning and understanding these kind of topics. And then an email address there if you ever want to get in touch with me for any reason, you want to reach out, you want to send me recommendations maybe, or ask some questions, anything like that, that email address there is for you to do that. I've added a bunch of ways to donate because I know people have different preferences about what platforms they use. So there's a variety here. You can make one-off donations, or you could sign up for monthly ones. For me personally, and I'm not talking about how people pay me, I'm talking about what I do to support other people. I like monthly because I send maybe $3-4 a month off to various creators. And I like the fact that I can just set it and forget it, and I know that I'm doing a little bit to support them and help them, put bread on the table and all these kind of things. So there's some crypto. I went back into my crypto wallet and I set up some payment methods for different cryptos. If you're interested and into using those, they're the only ones I can do at the moment. There might be some more added in the future. A little note here: if you do send crypto, let me know about it, because I have a cold wallet and I have to hook it up so that transfer can take place. And then there's just the usual affiliate links underneath for the Autonomy 12-week course of action, Richard Grove's work. The very independent producers. Now, this is one I'd like to highlight, actually. The VIP, Very Independent Producers Summit 1, 2, and 3. These are free events that you can watch. You just give your email address and then you get access to the events. But I've put, this is how you can learn how to make a living by teaching, producing content, defending the truth, and fighting for freedom with some of the world's hardest working content creators. And look at the names here. We got James Corbett, Mark Passio, Charlie Robinson of Macroaggressions podcast. He's great. G. Edward Griffin, the OG, he wrote The Creature from Jekyll Island. We've got John Bush of The Greater Reset and the Live Free Academy. Scott Armstrong, Rebunked podcast. Jay Dyer, Ryan Christian of TLAV, Last American Vagabond. Courtney Turner, she's wonderful. It's an incredible resource. It's free, and you get to learn what it takes to do something like these guys do. And I think, speaking for myself, a lot of these people helped keep me sane over the last 4 years, helped keep me grounded, helped me to get a grasp on actual reality, what's going on, why are these things happening, why does nothing make sense? And so I would really encourage anybody out there who wants to get an insight into this sort of process to have a look at those 3 summits. They're all great. And then underneath them, we've just got a lot of courses which are hosted at the Autonomy Agora Marketplace. And these are just shorter form courses if you want to have some info on a specific niche topic, such as building communities, such as philosophy as taught by Jay Dyer, such as logic and intellectual self-defense by Tony Myers of the Grand Theft World podcast. So I've just revamped that whole area, and I just wanted to let people know about that, so you can have a look and dive in there, and there's a lot of good stuff. And the main thing is just taking part and learning and continuing to spread the word and get other people, where possible, into the mind frame of we can understand the things that are going on. And my contention is that the best place to understand that stuff is in books, as I'm sure you all know by now. So that was the first thing I wanted to mention. Next thing I wanted to mention is that there's a Give Send Go page for the Last American Vagabond, which is active, and I think it was made live a day or 2 ago. So Ryan Christian at the Last American Vagabond, he's come under unexpectedly powerful attack, and there's a lot of lawsuits that have been raised against him. And they're designed to force him to shut down his operation over at Last American Vagabond, basically to get him to shut up. And if you know anything about him, and if you followed the Last American Vagabond's work at all for any amount of time, he's fantastic. He's got a high level of integrity. He's very honest. He always tells you when he's giving you his opinion, and he always tells you when he's giving you good knowledge and information based on the sources. He's got a very logical, analytical way, a very objective way of approaching his research and his content. And he is just a really hardworking guy. He puts out these 3, 4, 5 hour investigations. And, the ongoing joke is that he introduces his show by saying, "Oh, this is a concise show." And then he runs for 3, 4 hours or something. Anyway, he's put this up in the last few days, and you can see that the total he's raised is pretty incredible so far. This is going to help him fight off these legal battles, and I think it's a really worthy cause. I think Ryan Christian is one of the good guys, certainly. It's very easy to see. You don't have to listen long to him to get that sense. And so I just wanted to also mention that to people, that if you're looking for a way to keep alternative media alive, keep the truth and the information getting out there, which best serves humanity and best empowers us to get these parasites off our back, then I think this is a worthy cause to dive into and throw some money at. So there's a little preamble there. I wanted to get those on the record before we get into the book today. Okay, so yeah, the links, I'll put all the links for the things that I'm showing in the description box after we wrap up the show today. Alrighty, so on to today's topic. So I'll just go back to my no one can here. So we're getting into the story of the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, I'm sure anybody out there who is listening or is in the sort of sphere of content creators that I just talked about will have heard the Rockefeller Foundation, the Rockefellers as a family, their name get mentioned again and again and again and again. And they're often the subject of documentaries and films and exposés. And so it's very important to know about them. Who are they? Is there anything are they just good people, philanthropic people who care so much about the rest of us that they just devote all this wealth and into making our lives better? Or is there more to it? Is there something a little more sinister at play? Because they are one of the richest families in America. They have been influencing a variety of paradigms, such as, in particular, the medical paradigm and the educational paradigm, which we are all living under. And if you've been paying any attention over the last, 5-10 years, you will know that both of those paradigms are incredibly damaging and harmful and broken at this point. So this is going to be a key piece of history to get into, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book. But before we get into this particular one, I thought what I would first do is show you, because there might be some people out there who they want to know what books to get and what to look at and how to read around this topic and get educated on it. So the first thing I wanted to do was to get some books on the record, some other books on the record that you could get a hold of and buy and add to your collection and read and learn from. And so the first one is this one, which is Memoirs by David Rockefeller, 2002 book, and quite a chunk, 532 pages. But if we scroll down on this Amazon page here, we can get a bit of an insight into this family. So David Rockefeller was the youngest child of John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was one of the richest men in the United States. He graduated from Harvard College, and he studied at the London School of Economics. Now, if you've been following any of my videos, you will know that the London School of Economics was founded by Fabian socialists, and who were very close to Bertrand Russell. So in the read through of the Bertrand Russell book that we have on this channel, the playlist there, we did talk a little bit about the London School of Economics, and we did look into its history and its origin. The London School of Economics it's kind of like the British Council on Foreign Relations. Very important, influential organization there, and they're training mostly people who are non-native to I think 70 or 80% of their intake is from foreign countries, which is quite interesting. But anyway, he studied there, so he's got a link to these Fabian socialists. What are they called? There's a couple, isn't there? I forget their names now. Beatrice Webb is one of them, I think. So the whole Fabian socialist movement, who is still active to this day, is a key part of this puzzle, because they believed in gradualism. They believed in slow, gradual change. They had two symbols. One was the wolf in sheep's clothing, and the other one was the tortoise or the turtle, because they're looking decades and decades ahead to realize their plans. And this is what we're up against. We're up against schemes and plans that go back and shoot out into the future 50, 100 years. That's how far ahead these plans are looking to go. So we got to think on a bigger, longer time frame than just our monthly payday cycle that we're on at the minute, or just a countdown to Christmas every year. We got to think more generationally, and this will help us protect and preserve freedom for ourselves and future generations. This is how it's done, because this is what they're doing, and it all starts in these kind of organizations such as the London School of Economics. So it's good to know that David Rockefeller went there. It tells us as well that his service as an intelligence officer in North Africa and France brought him into contact with many of the individuals who would soon dominate European politics. So he's kind of rubbing shoulders and getting to know the people who run the politics here in Europe. So internationalist much? During his 87 years, David Rockefeller has worked with every US president since Eisenhower, at times serving as an unofficial emissary on high-level missions. So what does that sound like? Unofficial emissary. That sounds like a secret agent. That sounds like a James Bond type of character, to me at least. High-level missions? Missions on behalf of who? Who's giving him these missions? Is somebody sending him a mission that's going to self-destruct in 5 seconds? Is it a kind of Mission Impossible Tom Cruise kind of scenario, but in real life? So that phrase was curious. And that's not just a phrase that somebody's written on Amazon. That is actually on the inside of the book cover, which I have right here, and I'll show you in a minute. But also he's logged approximately 5 million miles while circling the globe dozens of times. And you can bet, I'm betting at least, that we're probably going to find out that the Rockefellers are really concerned about the environment, and they want to invest lots of money to save the environment because of climate change and all this pollution and all this global warming that's happening because we're flying around too much, yet he is clocking in 5 million miles. But that's just a guess. I don't know yet. I'm not sure if they're front and center when it comes to climate change or that particular scam. He was involved in the building of the World Trade Center. Very interesting. And this is the first time a Rockefeller has ever told his own story. And then he's called a financier, a philanthropist, and the ultimate ambassador. Sounds like a professional wrestling name. But I do have a copy of this book. So let's go over quickly here to the book cam. Here it is. This is my copy of David Rockefeller Memoirs. And I was really happy when I got this one because it was, I don't know, it was a reasonable price. But when I opened it up, I found that it has this little, and this is stuck on. This is a little piece of paper stuck on, but it's actually signed. And so I actually have signed testimony from the man himself, David Rockefeller, which I thought was cool. But yeah, you can tell that he's probably just signed a bunch of these cards here, and then they've been stuck into the books. So I don't actually know if it counts as a sort of first edition signed copy. I don't know if that pushed up the value or not. But anyway, nice little artifact on the inside. And one of the reasons that this book is extremely well known and often talked about and infamous is because of a particular quote, which I have marked up here. So if we go straight in to page, this is page 404. This is chapter 27, Proud Internationalist. So the chapter tells you a lot about it. He is a proud internationalist. What kind of people are international? What kind of things are internationalists interested in? Well, strengthening connections, breaking down borders, rolling out systems which encompass the whole of the earth and manage the whole population of the earth, whether that's financially, whether that's food, culture. This is the kind of real globalist effort to make everyone into a homogenous grey blob of nothingness. And it's the kind of thinking and the kind of internationalism and globalism is why borders are not respected and looked after and protected in many cases, and why there's Coca-Cola, Starbucks, and Pepsi all over the planet wherever you go. And these corporations, which are multinational and often have a bigger GDP than countries, are allowed to operate. And this is the kind of thinking and the kind of guy who pushes that and makes it a reality. So he's a proud internationalist. But the quote we want to get on the record here, the very important one, and I'll zoom in a little bit so you can read that, hopefully. We got populist paranoia. And he says, right at the top there, hang on, that's totally out of focus, isn't it? Let's try that again. Okay. He says, for more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents, such as my encounter with Castro, to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it. So there you are, a signed confession testimony from the man himself, David Rockefeller, that he is an internationalist and he's proud of it, and he's part of a secret cabal working to bring in a one world government. Perhaps. Could it be? So that's the first book I wanted to tell you about. And as you can see, you can get it relatively cheap. There's used and new copies here. There's a hardcover there for less than £9. Wouldn't you want to get that and preserve it as a bit of evidence to send forth into the future? So there you are. There's memoirs. Another book that I think is very key and critical to this conversation, which I do not own and I have not read, but I am aware of, is this one, The Molecular Vision of Life by Lily E. Kay. And this is Caltech, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the rise of the new biology. So I know that this book deals with and charts the transformation of Darwinian evolutionary theory into eugenics and population control and the science that go along with that, was then rebranded and became molecular biology. And so that's the new skin over that whole movement to interfere, to control to bring about the preservation of the favored races, which is Darwin's subtitle for his book on the origin of species. And I know this book is quite pricey. This one, it's a bit harder to find physical copies of it, but you got a good 300 pages there. And this is linking the Rockefeller Foundation, their investments and their philanthropy to that whole effort, that whole rebranding. So that's the link for that's going to be underneath. You want to grab a PDF of that and at least preserve an electronic copy, maybe print it out and maybe make it just something you have that you can show to people, lend to people and teach other people with, because that's what this channel is all about. It's just empowering people with knowledge so we can turn it into understanding and then we can spread some wisdom. So Molecular Vision of Life, that's another one. A third one, and this is a newer book, right? And this is Rockefeller Controlling the Game by Jacob Nordangard. And so, as you can see here, the first run of this book is sold out. But this gentleman, Jacob Nordangard, he has a PhD. And now I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that he had a hard time getting his PhD because of the subject of what he was talking about. But in the end, he successfully defended it and he was awarded it and he did get the PhD. But as you can see, this copy is sold out. There is going to be a second edition. And it says published on the 20th of February. So that time's come and gone. That should be out, I suppose. But another more up-to-date book. So I think this would be a good one to look at and read and get a copy of, because as time moves forward, more and more documents become available, things get declassified, and we can do, with the power of the internet as well, we can do some deeper research and marshalling of evidence. I think this would be a good one to get hold of. You can go to this website here, which is Pharaoh's Media Productions. You can get the ebook, which is I think about £8 or £9, or you can pre-order it on Amazon. And yeah, it looks like it's slated for a 23rd of May release. But this is the second edition here, and £20 on Amazon. Why not? Nearly 500 pages. You probably learn quite a bit from that. Okay, so this is another, I'll put this in the link underneath. This is an interview with the author. This is a 2-hour interview on Ivor Cummings' channel. And as you can see, I got the top comment here that nobody's commented on it since I did 8 months ago. And here he is. This is Ivor. And he's having a conversation here and just giving the whistle-stop tour of what's in the book, what he discovered, and how influential this family and their foundation have actually been in the shaping of the world that we live in now and the plans that are unfolding around us in real time. So that's another good resource if you can't afford the book, but you can afford the time to invest in doing some learning. And it's 2 hours, but you can always speed it up and put it on a 1.25 or a 1.5 to get that information a little bit faster, because I know time is our most valuable asset, but there's another option as well. And this is Jacob Nordangard's YouTube channel, so I'll link to this as well. And as you can see in the videos, his most recent video, he was talking to James Corbett 2 weeks ago. I haven't heard that yet, but I'm sure that's fantastic because James Corbett, he's always good. And Jacob also has these long-form presentations. So this is UN Leaders Pact for the Future, and this is a planetary emergency. All good free resources to learn about this agenda and its connections with the organizations that we are taught not to question. We are taught just to assume that the UN is benevolent and the WHO is benevolent and the philanthropic foundations are all benevolent and they just care so much about us little people down here. Great resources, all free. And then when I was scrolling down and going through his videos, the other thing I found out, which was quite interesting, was that this fellow, Jacob, is actually the lead singer of a heavy metal band. And he's got a music video there of a song called Looking for the Green Fairy. I wonder if that's something to do with environmentalism. I'm not sure. But they have 2 albums out on Spotify now. So if you're into heavy metal, it's nice to see a man of many talents and to see that he's got many strings to his bow, not just a one-trick pony. So that's maybe a more niche thing that somebody out there might be interested in. Cool. So a little more. This book is Thy Will Be Done, The Conquest of the Amazon, Nelson Rockefeller and Evangelism in the Age of Oil. This one is harder to find. They actually don't. They got an MP3 CD available and a Kindle edition available, but actually no physical copies available on Amazon. So that tells you a lot right there. When books are disappearing from Amazon and they're hard to get hold of, tells you there's probably something in there worth reading. So maybe grabbing yourself a electronic copy or scouring some of the secondhand books, bookshops, or bookfinder.com and keeping an eye on that and checking it regularly to see if copies do come up. I am grateful to say that I did manage to grab one of these before it disappeared. It's a ridiculous book. I mean, just the size of it is insane. It's one of the biggest, like, on my bookshelf, I think. It's not quite as long as Tragedy and Hope, but it's getting up there. I haven't read this one yet, but I'm preserving it, and it could be a good one to go through. And we've got some good artifacts there, pictures. I think it's going to be quite a fascinating read. And just the fact that it's hard to find now and very expensive tells me there's going to be some good information in there that we need to know. So that's another one to keep an eye out for, maybe get a hold of a copy. Now, this book is, as you can see on this little bit here, is book 25 of 27 of the Forbidden Bookshelf. The Forbidden Bookshelf is a 27-book series published on Amazon. I don't know who put it together, but it's actually it's a stimulating account of the capitalists who changed America in the 19th and 20th centuries, setting the stage for the 1929 crash and Great Depression. And this series of books is, I don't have all of them, but I think it's a really good place to learn and to get an idea of the kind of people, the names, the organizations who we should be looking at when we're trying to understand what's going on in the world. And as you can see, some of these books are not even available anymore. Some of them are very expensive. But all sorts of topics here. The Phoenix program by Douglas Valentine is about Vietnam and the anti-terrorist program designed by the CIA and the torture of innocent Vietnamese. I do have a softback copy of that one. This one is The DuPont Dynasty by Gerald Colby, who wrote the book we just looked at. Yeah, you can see some of these prices are crazy. That just tells me that there's good stuff in there and we got to read it and keep an eye out for them. And, you know, if you're patient and you're diligent and you keep an eye out, you can often grab these when somebody posts them online at a small price without doing their research. So that's a good resource as well. Just the 27 books there. I don't know who put this list together, but I think it's worth diving into and being aware of those books at least. And I think that is it. That is it for our preamble. Now, the only other thing that I might want to tell you about here is just a few other books before we get into the main event, because it's all about books on this channel. 3 more to recommend. And again, I haven't read all of these. I've just heard other people describe them and talk about them, and I've decided, okay, probably worth grabbing, preserving. This is Rockefeller Internationalist. This is The Man Who Misrules the World. And Josephson is the author there. That's quite an old one. I think that might be a good one to read after the story of the Rockefeller Foundation, because it's actually published in the same year, 1952. So the year that we have the story of the Rockefeller as written by the president of the foundation, we also have this one being released, which is I think, going to be probably a less flattering account. But as well as that, we've got Rockefeller Medicine Men, Medicine and Capitalism in America. This is not a first edition. As you can see, it's a kind of hardback reprint, but it looks faithful to the original. It looks like a scan and print of the original. And this is just all about how the current medical paradigm, the allopathic medical system, was really heavily influenced by the Rockefellers and their investments and their pushing of the molecular vision of life as described in Lily E. Kay's book. And then last but not least, we have the Rockefellers, An American Dynasty by Peter Collier and David Horowitz. Maybe we'll turn that light off. That might give us a better view. And this one is referred to very often by people who make documentaries because, again, this is another sort of approved account. And you got on the inside some family tree. So you can trace them back to 1810. This goes all the way up to the 60s. So another good resource that you can find, grab a copy, preserve it, and have a better understanding about who these people are and what they're up to and just what the hell is going on in the world today. All right. So that is my little intro spiel. I hope that was useful. It's quite long, but useful stuff to get on the record. And for anyone just diving into this or watching this series on the replay, hopefully that's given you a lot of useful avenues to explore and books to buy if that's what you're into. So we'll just have a quick look in the chat, see how everyone's getting on. Okay, Gwen, good morning. Oh, I confused Andrew with Mother's Day because it's not Mother's Day there, but he's going to call his mum anyway. Good man, good son. LJ says Instagram's good. You should take screenshots of recent books, save to photos, and then have a list. Yeah, that's exactly what I've been doing. Whenever people like Richard Grove, Jay Dyer, when they have the book cam or they hold the books up, I just screenshot it and then just keep an eye out, really. So that's a good way to do it too. Awesome. Peter's saying that, and I might have to be a bit more cautious about how I refer to people, but the Windows software guru has taken over from the Rockefellers these days, and I think you might be right there. Emma dropped in to say hi, good evening. Yeah, awesome. LJ says, Ivor Cummins is great. Started listening to him at the start of Divok. Helped me to understand a lot what was going on. Yeah, I thought he was really good. I really do think he was good. Fliffle Flaffle, welcome. I'm not sure I've seen you here before, but it's good to have you here. And you're saying Alan Watt of Cutting Through the Matrix used to recommend such books. He passed away a few years ago. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Alan Watt. His wonderful wife, Melissa, is continuing to get his talks broadcast onto BitChute and YouTube. They even have a book study group now, and they're working their way through Tragedy and Hope. They have a Telegram group, and that's full of really great people too. I've been getting to know that group and contributing there. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of Alan Watt and his work. Very measured, very sensible, very suspicious of groups and groupthink. So if you are like-minded in the sense that whenever there's a group movement or a groundswell and everyone's saying and believing and doing the same thing and you get a bit suspicious, Alan Watt's a good guy to listen to because he was he had a very incisive mind, and he did go to the first-hand documents, borrowing books from the library. And I asked his wife about his books. I was like, where are they? What's in the collection? Can we get a list? And she said that actually he was just loaning a lot of them from libraries. So this was back when libraries had good books in them. And he was putting that to use and going and borrowing these and building his talks around them. But yeah, he's a fantastic resource. I love listening to his stuff. And he's a very comprehensive account of what's going on. He can deliver that high level view very in a way that's very easy to understand, as well as diving into the nuance when it comes to recommending books and stuff as well. So that is my intro. Good to have you here, Heidi. Good day. And you're very welcome. I'm happy to be here sharing with you. Wicked. So with that preamble out of the way, let's dive into the story of the Rockefeller Foundation by Raymond B. Fosdick. Cool. I just moved my screen over here so I'm not looking over there. I might have a little sip of coffee as well. Fliffle Flaffle says, would I be able to interview Alan Watt's wife? That's a great question. It's something I've thought about, branching out into interviews. I have a few people in mind. I wanted to keep the focus of the channel and the content really, really heavily book focused. And so that is something I would definitely be interested in. And now that I have, I'm a member of the Telegram group, I can kind of feel the water a little bit and see if it's possible to set that up. But thank you for the suggestion. All right, LJ is going to catch up later, leaving now. I hope you have a blessed day as well. Thank you for saying so. Enjoy yourself. Okay, let's get into it. This is why we're here. So it says on the front cover, how the world's greatest philanthropic organization has changed the lives of millions in America and many other countries. Its aims, its plan of operation, and the men who made it work. So no women working for the Rockefeller Foundation, apparently. Okay, on the back here, we have got a little bit about the author. So let's learn about Raymond B. Fosdick. There's a picture of him there. I think that's coming through loud and clear. So it says, no one, with the possible exception of Mr. Rockefeller himself, could be better qualified to write a history of the Rockefeller Foundation than Raymond B. Fosdick. Since 1919, he has been prominently identified with the Rockefeller interests. He has served as a trustee of all the philanthropic boards created by Mr. Rockefeller, including the Rockefeller Foundation, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, the General Education Board, the International Education Board, the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial, the China Medical Board, Incorporated, and the Spelman Fund of New York. From 1936 to 1948, he was president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Dr. Fosdick, oh, I didn't know he was a doctor. Did it say that on the front? No, dude's a doctor. Dr. Fosdick was educated at Princeton and the New York Law School. In the early part of his career, he served New York City under several administrations in the capacity of Assistant Corporation Counsel, Commissioner of Accounts, and as a member of the Board of Education. During the First World War, he was chairman of the Commission on Training Camp Activities of the War Department and civilian aide to General Pershing in France, receiving the Distinguished Service Medal for his work. In 1919, he was appointed Under Secretary General of the League of Nations, and the League of Nations, as many people will probably know, but it's worth repeating, the League of Nations was the forerunner to the EU, what we have now. So he was the Undersecretary General of the League of Nations, and he helped organize the Secretariat, resigning when the Senate turned down President Wilson's proposals. So President Wilson is important and relevant because we just finished our read-through of Lusitania by Colin Simpson, and President Wilson was the incumbent at the time, and he had Colonel House whispering in his ear, and they featured fairly prominently in, not prominently, but they featured in the Lusitania story. Notably, President Wilson refused to warn Americans not to sail on that ship, even though the German embassy had put out warnings to people to not sail on the ship when it sank. So interesting figure, and sounds like President Wilson and this gentleman were in cahoots because Raymond Fosdick resigned when Wilson's proposals were turned down. So it's kind of like, it sounds like they're on the same page. They wanted the same outcome. And when they didn't get it, they resigned and went off to do something else. So he resumed the practice of law in New York City, and at that time became interested in the various Rockefeller philanthropies, an interest that was to absorb most of his time and energies until his retirement in 1948. Dr. Fosdick now lives in Newtown, Connecticut, where he devotes his time to writing. And yes, Heidi says, doctor of what? That's a good question, isn't it? Just doctor. He's just a doctor. Don't question it. He's a doctor of philanthropy. All right. So just a little moment to sort of dwell on the artifact itself. I love these old books. Look at this down here, 25 shillings. I think that was probably when it first came out. We got a little stamp. It says the Newman Demographic Survey. I'm not quite sure what that is. But on the page here, we got a portrait of the man himself. This is John Davison Rockefeller Sr. Now look at that face. Doesn't he look like he's brimming with love and compassion and empathy for the entirety of the human race? I actually feel like he wants to kill me. Like his eyes, I feel like he's looking at me with disdain, and like I'm some sort of insect that he really wants to swat. Like, check out that fella. Philanthropy. All right, story of Rockefeller Foundation, and we've got a foreword by John D. Rockefeller Jr. So this picture we just looked at is senior, but the foreword is written by his son Junior. So we'll get to that soon. Just briefly though, we've got zoom in there. We've got a 1952 publication date. First published in Britain in 1952. I think this is the first British printing, if I'm not mistaken. And contents, well, we'll kind of discover the contents as we read through the book, but I'll just pause there for anyone who wants to grab a screenshot. But some interesting stuff. We've got agriculture, so there's food, there's medical education, so that's medicine, and we've also got China, and they've got public health. So they're very interested in food, experimental biology. That's curious. The problem of social sciences, and so it's like food, it's the medical system, experimenting. Probably on people, I would imagine, and China as well. Now, I think this book does have quite a bit admitted with regards to how involved the Rockefellers were in China. I think that's part of the reason why Richard Grove has mentioned this book a few times. And the humanistic studies, investment in leadership, and then chapter 22 is throughout the world. So, some curious stuff there. Let's get into the foreword by John D. Rockefeller Jr. This is the 13th of September, 1951. The history of the Rockefeller Foundation, established by my father in 1913 to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world, here written by the masterly pen of Raymond B. Fosdick, for 12 years president of the foundation, is a dramatic story of worldwide service. As one of my close and valued associates for nearly 40 years, Mr. Fosdick, not doctor, just Mr., had more to do than anyone else with planning and developing the work of the foundation and its related organizations. The General Education Board, the International Health Board, the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial, and the International Education Board. That its Board of Trustees has seen fit to have a history of the Rockefeller Foundation written would be as great a satisfaction to the founder as it is to his son. So John D. Rockefeller Jr. is trying to convince us that this guy cares about the well-being of mankind throughout the world. I don't buy it. All right, we'll get into the introduction. Yeah. It's coming through all right, isn't it? Cool. Introduction. This book attempts to tell the story of the Rockefeller Foundation, established by John D. Rockefeller Sr. in 1913. But Mr. Rockefeller created other philanthropic trusts, and because these various organizations are frequently confused in the public mind, it may be worthwhile at the outset to identify them. The first organization which he established was the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. This was in 1901. 2 years later, he set up the General Education Board for the promotion of education within the United States and its territories. In 1913, he launched the Rockefeller Foundation, and in 1918, the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial in memory of his wife. Each of these organizations was completely independent of the others, controlling its own funds under its own board of trustees. Mr. Rockefeller's total gifts to these trusts, figured at the market price of the day on which each was made, were as follows. I'm not going to read out these numbers, but it'd be interesting to calculate these values in today's money, including inflation. But that was massive. You got 60 million to the medical research, 129 million to general education, 182 million to Rockefeller Foundation. So that is vast amounts of money. I mean, just think about what a good person could do in the world with that amount of money. What would you do with it? If you had that amount of money to improve things for the most amount of people, what would you do? Would you do this? Would you set up a charitable philanthropic foundation? So in total, it was $446 million. So it'd be good to know what that figure is in today's money. In 1923, John D. Rockefeller Jr. created the International Education Board, to which he gave $20 million. This was done because the General Education Board, under its charter, could not work overseas. The International Education Board has spent its funds and has been wound up. In 1928, the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial was consolidated with the Rockefeller Foundation. One or two of its specialized functions which did not fit into the program of the foundation were transferred to a new organization called the Spelman Fund of New York, which was given $10 million by the memorial to carry on its work. This fund, in turn, has been wound up. Of the original group of organizations, therefore, only 3 remain today: the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, the General Education Board, and the Rockefeller Foundation. The expenditures by these various boards, exclusive of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which maintains its own work and does not make grants for other purposes, are as follows. So the Rockefeller Foundation has a total of $451 million. So that's the expenditures. So they're spending $451 million. General Education Board has an expenditure of $296 million. The Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial is $55 million, and the International Education Board is $18 million, for a grand total of $822 million. I'm already getting bored of looking at these massive numbers. Like they always use big numbers to impress or bedazzle or wow or scare people even, Think back to the great scam of 2020 when all these numbers were being thrown around, and we're supposed to be impressed or awed or more believing that these are good people because of these big numbers. I don't know. There's a footnote down here which says, this table calls for 3 comments. 1, net appropriation is the amount appropriated less unused balances which have been allowed to lapse. Income does not include capital gains. Right, so they're not even including capital gains in that. Number 2, during the period covered, the Rockefeller Foundation appropriated to the General Education Board for its corporate purposes the sum of $10.7 million. Consequently, this sum represents a duplication because it occurs in the expenditure of 2 boards and is thus counted twice in the grand total. 3, the apparent discrepancy in the principal fund, after deductions of appropriations chargeable to it, is accounted for by the fact that profits accrued in the sale of securities given by Mr. Rockefeller or purchased by the foundation. So there you are. Although all these organizations were independent entities, they worked in close cooperation, and it is impossible to tell the story of one without constant reference to the others. So he just said to us that they were all independent and they had their own boards of trustees and completely independent of the others. Each of these organizations was completely independent of the others. On the next page, it is impossible to tell the story of one without constant reference to the others. Okay, Raymond. In medical education, for example, the field was divided between the Foundation and the General Education Board, the former assuming responsibility for what was done abroad, and the latter limiting its efforts to the problem within the United States. Similarly, in the social sciences, one cannot give an adequate picture of the activities of the Foundation without reference to the earlier work in this field by the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial, nor can the story of the natural sciences be told without including the previous work of the General Education Board and the International Education Board. Consequently, while the aim of this book is concentrated on the operations of the Foundation, it necessarily includes, in some instances, a wider focus. This book is primarily for laymen, not for specialists. It was written by a layman who makes no pretense of being anything else, apart from he's a doctor, apparently. The range of the activities of the Rockefeller Foundation is so vast and covers so many fields that any description prepared for specialists would have to be prepared by a group, not by an individual. In writing this volume, I have had in mind the public interest in the activities of the country's oldest and largest foundations. The record of this foundation is part of the social history of the times, And while my own connection with the organization has been close and intimate, I have tried as far as I could to present the story objectively. It is scarcely necessary to say that in the preparation of the volume, I have had complete access to the files, not only of the foundation, but of the other philanthropic boards established by John D. Rockefeller and his son. So that's very key. He's saying here, I have had complete access to the files. So very key. I have also had an opportunity to examine the papers relating to the early history of these boards in the files of Mr. Rockefeller Jr. The old letterpress books of the American Baptist Education Society for the final 2 decades of the last century were also available, with their interesting sidelights on the early history of Frederick T. Gates and his relations with Mr. Rockefeller. Frederick T. Gates, that's an interesting last name, isn't it, right there? I think Peter was one step ahead of us. Through the courtesy of his son, Russell Gates, I had the use of Mr. Gates' unpublished autobiography, which is in manuscript form, and Mrs. Dorothy Olcott Gates, Elsmith, of Woods Hole, Massachusetts, Mr. Gates' daughter-in-law, generously made available a wealth of his letters, papers, and memoranda. In referring to this collection in this book, I call them the Gates Papers. I also had the advantage of using the confidential monthly reports written by George W. Gray of the staff of the Foundation over the years 1937 to date. These reports, based on careful study of current projects, were prepared for the information of the trustees and proved to be of invaluable assistance. I am indebted, too, to a narrative chronicle of the Foundation's early history based on its day-to-day correspondence, diaries, and records. This formidable undertaking, filling 21 large typewritten volumes, was the intelligent work of Mrs. Lloyd Almirall, a member of the staff who spent a number of years on the project. But she didn't get a mention on the back cover here when he talked about the men in the men in the amazing men in the Rockefeller Foundation. Or was that the foreword, actually? Yeah, anyway. Part of the record here presented is based on my personal contacts with the various Rockefeller boards, on all of which, with the exception of the original Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, I served as a trustee. These organizations included the Rockefeller Foundation, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, the General Education Board, the International Education Board, the China Medical Board Incorporated, the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial, and the Spelman Fund. Consequently, I was personally and often intimately acquainted with the men whose work is described in these pages. And inasmuch as my association with Mr. Rockefeller, Jr., began in 1913, the year the Rockefeller Foundation was established, there is a sense in which I lived with the organization from its birth, although I did not become a trustee until 1921. However, I have tried in all cases to base my personal recollections, an often inaccurate source of information, on the records and documents of the Foundation and its sister organizations. Perhaps a word should be said about the terminal date of the period covered by this history. Generally speaking, it runs to the end of my administration as president, the 30th of June, 1948. But in the use of total figures, I have employed 31st of December 1950 as a more suitable date, and once or twice, when the development of the narrative seemed to require it, I have extended the story into the regime of my successor, Chester I. Bernard. Because the history deals primarily with the Rockefeller Foundation, I have not presumed to mention the foundations created by other individuals, not a few of which played an essential role in the development of the fields cultivated by the Rockefeller boards. As I have pointed out in the text, many agencies were engaged in the same pattern of work and often on the same projects. It would take a far larger volume than this to tell the complete story, and this history is necessarily limited to the contribution of a single organization. To my former associates among the trustees, officers, and members of the staff of the Foundation, I am indebted for so many kinds of help that I scarcely know how to express my thanks. Mr. Rockefeller Jr. was responsible for my undertaking this task, and his counsel and encouragement have been of continued assistance. Walter W. Stewart, who succeeded Mr. Rockefeller as chairman of the Foundation's Board of Trustees, contributed generously in terms both of time and critical judgment. The same is true of the officers Chester I. Barnard, president of the foundation, Flora M. Rind, its secretary, Thomas N. Debevoise, and Chauncey Belknap, its legal advisor, Dr. George K. Strode and Dr. Andrew J. Warren of the International Health Division, Dr. Alan Gregg of the Medical Science Division, Warren Weaver of the Natural Sciences Division, Joseph H. Willits of the Social Sciences Division, and David H. Stevens and John Marshall of the Division of the Humanities, the Treasurer's and the Comptroller's offices, under the leadership of Edward Robinson and George J. Beale, respectively, responded unfailingly to my constant demand for figures, and H.B. Van Wessep, head of the Foundation's Office of Publications, was most helpful. I would want to mention particularly Mrs. Julia M. H. Carson, who worked with me for 2 years on this project. She brought distinguished talent to the task, and for her skilled assistance in gathering and ordering material, in helping to create the outlines of the story, and in the preliminary shaping of some of the chapters, I can never be sufficiently grateful. Finally, I must mention the gifted service of George W. Gray of the staff of the Foundation, who assisted me in the preparation of the natural science chapters, a field whose technical terminology is often baffling to a layman. In justice to all these friends and associates, however, I hasten to acquit them of any responsibility for the statements made or the opinions expressed in this volume, or for any errors of omission or commission, or for faults in emphasis or perspective. The book is mine, and I am solely responsible for it. Raymond B. Fosdick, Newtown, Connecticut, 14th of August, 1951. So, how about that? I just realized I don't have a bookmark. 1 second. I'm going to just take a sip and have a look at the comments. The United Nations, Peter says he worked for them back in Timor-Leste. Leste, is that a place? Mr. Microsoft is the largest farmer in the world or US. Yeah, I think definitely in the US. I'm not sure about the world, but definitely in the US, Peter. Heidi says, this will make me angry and sad. I must watch later. Sunday morning prayer now. Thank you, Nick. God bless you all. Yes, Heidi, I'm hopefully, yeah, I know what you mean. It's going to be frustrating, isn't it? I think it might be quite a dry read. Like he was saying, it seems like it's going to be lots of facts and figures, but one of those which we're probably not going to get much of a narrative. I don't know. I could be wrong. I feel like it's going to be dry, but we'll see. Rosemary says, wonder where they got all that money from back then in the USA. Not from USA. Yeah, I think maybe oil originally. I think they were into oil, way back in their lineage, and they sort of pivoted. I think Rockefeller famous, was it one of the Rockefellers who was really, he had a really bad reputation, so they had to like reinvent his image as a philanthropist, and they filmed him giving out pennies. I think that was a Rockefeller. Correct me if I'm wrong. I could be wrong about that totally. But I think what I got from that intro is that he has access to the official papers, so that's very critical. Kind of in the same way that Carol Quigley of Tragedy and Hope, which I'm pointing to over my shoulder there, he had access to the private papers of the Council on Foreign Relations, and so he was the man with the best access to their own documents and their own accounts of what's going on. It sounds like Raymond Fosdick here was the man with that kind of access, and so we can't so easily dismiss what he's saying as we move forward in the book. He had the documents, he had personal access to members of the family, and sounds like he also had a lot of help and support from people who worked in the foundation itself. So I think there's a strong case that the information in this book is going to be reliable, and it's going to be something a bit concrete that we can kind of believe and learn from. It was interesting to see, what was it, Frederick T. Gates mentioned, and I was wondering if he's related to Bill. And so the first thing that pops up tells me that Frederick T. Gates is an American philanthropist and businessman. Of course he's a philanthropist, a major figure in Rockefeller interests, who spearheaded the endowment drive that created the University of Chicago. He was an American Baptist clergyman. Hang on, let me let's see if we can. I'll show you what I'm looking at. Then you're not just listening to me read. Frederick Taylor Gates, American Baptist and clergyman, and of course philanthropic advisor to the oil industrialists. Yeah, so I think the Rockefellers' money came from oil, and that's John D. Rockefeller Sr., that cheerful fella. Be good to sit down and have a pint with him, wouldn't it? Pour it over his head, perhaps. But I want to find out if this guy is at all related to Bill. Looks like there's nothing about William. Descendants. Frederick, his son, married Patricia, the daughter of Forbes. Okay, here we go. Not related to... it says, contrary to persistent internet rumors, Frederick Taylor Gates is not related to Billy, the co-founder of Microshite. So, yeah, apparently not. But just because a sentence on on Wikipedia says it's not the case, I would take that with a pinch of salt. Let's have a look at the fact check that they're sending us to. Check your fact. Yeah, that looks legit, doesn't it? So I don't know. My verdict is that the jury's still out on that one, but it seems perhaps there is no connection there. But what would be the odds of like two influential families with the last name Gates both getting into philanthropy and being so closely connected with the medical paradigm and the development of these kind of organizations? What are the odds? But anyway, jury's out. Peter's saying, it used to be in Indonesia. Now their flag doesn't come up, one of the youngest countries today. Okay, nice. I bet you got some good stories from that time living in Indonesia. I never made it over to that country, unfortunately. Adamski says, I think that number would be 51 billion at the start. Oh, okay. Did I read a number wrong? Apologies if that's the case. All right. So sounds like this is, if we want to know about the Rockefeller Foundation, this is the guy to tell us about it. But it also sounds like very likely that this fella's going to be some kind of gatekeeper, because if he's working so closely with the, John D. Rockefeller Jr., if he's working so closely with the head of the family at the time, then he's going to be under instructions, I would have thought, to leave things out. If there's anything to leave out, he would have been the kind of one, he would have been told, don't put that in there. So there could be, there's a good chance that things are getting left out. So while he's, on the face of it, appears like a very reliable source, access to the documents, first-hand access to the people, he could also be performing the role of gatekeeper and burying or omitting things. And he even says here, any errors of omission are my fault, and I'm solely responsible for it. So it's interesting, isn't it? If with further learning and reading, we find out there's things that he didn't write in this book, he's being the fault. He's claiming that it's his fault. Don't blame the Rockefeller family. Don't blame anyone else. It's me. He's dying. He's jumping on his sword. He's diving on the grenade, and he's taking that hit right there in the introduction. Adamski's saying 446 million in days' money. What is 51 billion? Oh, right. The number at the start would be 51 billion. Oh, I got you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So I was saying that amount, let me get the book cam back up to just explain that. This amount here, you're saying. So this number is the amount that that Mr. Rockefeller gifted to these various trusts. 446 million in today's money would be 51 billion. Ooh. So a not insignificant amount of cash right there. So let's crack on with chapter 1. This chapter 1 might be all I have time for today, but we'll see. 28 pages. We'll see what time it is and how we get on. So chapter 1, and thank you for that, Adamski. Appreciate it. The background of the idea. Frederick T. Gates was a man of remarkable qualities. A former Baptist minister, he became the principal advisor in business and philanthropy of John D. Rockefeller. He combined bold imagination and large horizons with shrewd business capacity and driving energy. In a candid bit of portraiture, he described himself in 1891 as, quote, eager, impetuous, insistent, and withal exacting and irritable, end quote. And this is a footnote saying, superior figures refer to notes, which will be found in a group beginning on page 335. All right, so that's just telling us the notes are going to be at the back of the book. In addition, it may be said that he was fearless, often fiery in his words, powerful in exhortation, with a mind that was too precipitous to be always tolerant, and with a voice that thundered from Sinai. So with a mind too precipitous to be always tolerant. That sounds to me like, oh, he was too intelligent to be kind. At his last meeting as a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation in 1923, he made a farewell speech. Shaking his fist at a somewhat startled but respectfully attentive board, he vociferated, quote, when you die and come to approach the judgment of Almighty God, what do you think he will demand of you? Do you, for an instant, presume to believe that he will inquire into your petty failures or your trivial virtues? No. He will ask just one question. What did you do as a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation? Wow. End quote. In spite of his evangelical fervor, indeed, perhaps because of it, he was one of the chief architects of that extraordinary group of foundations which Mr. Rockefeller established in the first 2 decades of the century. One would have to search over wide areas to find 2 men who were so completely different in temperament. Mr. Gates was a vivid, outspoken, self-revealing personality who brought an immense gusto to his work. Mr. Rockefeller was quiet, cool, taciturn about his thoughts and purposes, almost stoic in his repression. Mr. Gates had an eloquence which could be passionate when he was aroused. Mr. Rockefeller, when he spoke at all, spoke in a slow, measured fashion, lucidly and penetratingly, but without raising his voice and without gestures. Mr. Gates was overwhelming and sometimes overbearing in argument. Mr. Rockefeller was a man of infinite patience who never showed irritation or spoke chidingly about anyone. Never showed irritation? I don't know. Does he not look irritated in that picture to you? I think so. He also kind of looks reptilian, doesn't he? Mr. Gates summed up his impression of Mr. Rockefeller in this sentence. If he was very nice and precise in his choice of words, he was also nice and accurate in his choices of silences. And yet these 2 men who worked together so intimately and understandingly for 40 years shared certain strong resemblances. Both were self-made men who had come out of humble circumstances in their youth. That reminds me of the origins of the Rothschilds in the Romance of the Rothschilds book that we read, doesn't it? Just came out of nowhere and pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. Both were inspired by deep religious convictions. Both were endowed with a capacity for bold planning and large designs. Each was a pioneer in his own way, adventurous in spirit, eager for new methods and new ideas, ready to drive at a gallop when the way opened ahead. Their long relationship was one of mutual respect and confidence. In his book, Random Reminiscences of Man and Events, Mr. Rockefeller referred to Mr. Gates as, quote, possessing a combination of rare business ability, very highly developed and very honorably exercised, overshadowed by a passion to accomplish some great and far-reaching benefits to mankind, the influence of which will last, end quote. On his side, in his autobiography, as yet unpublished, and in his private papers, Mr. Gates wrote constantly of Mr. Rockefeller's sincerity and earnestness, the superior quality of his mind, and his statesman-like grasp of detail. Years later, he said of Mr. Rockefeller, quote, he was a very reserved man, admitting few confidences, and these only in times of very high nervous tension and altogether exceptional stress. His usual attitude towards all men was one of deep reserve, concealed beneath commonplace and humorous anecdotes. And apologies if you can hear the dog barking out there. He had the art with friends and guests of chatting freely, of calling out others, but of revealing little or nothing of his own innermost thoughts." End quote. There was another member of this informal partnership who was destined to play a notable part in the creation and development of vast philanthropic enterprises, Mr. Rockefeller's only son, John D. Rockefeller Jr. Graduating from Brown University in 1897, in his 23rd year, he entered his father's office at once. Quote, "I felt that if I was going to learn to help father in the care of his affairs," he afterward wrote, "the sooner my apprenticeship under his guidance began, the better." End quote. Few father and son relationships have been characterized by more genuine trust or by deeper affection. For 40 years, they worked closely and intimately together. The younger Rockefeller had many of the qualities which his father most admired: conscientiousness, tireless industry, practical judgment, and a capacity to sift the relevant from the irrelevant. These qualities were tempered by a modesty which was characteristic of both men. For, as Alan Nevin says in his biography of Mr. Rockefeller, quote, "he always dealt with his wealth in humility, not in arrogance." End quote. Sounds like a great bloke. It was this three-cornered partnership that was responsible for a group of foundations to which Mr. Rockefeller ultimately contributed nearly $500 million. It was a partnership singularly equipped for its task. Mr. Gates and Mr. Rockefeller Jr. shared in the exploration of new ideas, while the elder Rockefeller retained final decision in all large matters and worked closely with his two assistants. It was a healthy relationship of complete frankness in which both lieutenants told Mr. Rockefeller exactly what they believed. Mr. Rockefeller Jr. had this great advantage. Like all sons, he belonged to a younger generation than his father, and the relationship between the two was so intimate that he could help to explain and interpret ideas and points of view which age finds unfamiliar. Mr. Gates, who could never be anything but candid and forthright, used to thunder at the elder Rockefeller. "Your fortune is rolling up like an avalanche. You must keep up with it. You must distribute it faster than it grows. If you do not, it will crush you and your children and your children's children." In his autobiography, Mr. Gates records, quote, "I felt that he was entitled to my ultimate thought frankly expressed. I did not consciously allow his anticipated views to control or to modify my own views in the least degree. On the contrary, when I knew there would be a conflict of view, I took special pains to fortify my position instead of yielding it or concealing it. I was there to present my own views, with courtesy indeed, but with absolute and undeviating frankness and truth. This, therefore, I always did." End quote. But this was precisely what Mr. Rockefeller wanted. In all his business life, his invariable practice had been to surround himself with strong characters or of independent judgment. And like his son after him, who wanted no yes-men among his advisors, a man who could work with powerful and dominating figures like John D. Archbold and H. H. Rogers and Henry M. Flagler, would appreciate the value of Mr. Gates. Years later, he said of Mr. Gates, "He combines business skill and philanthropic aptitude to a higher degree than any other man I have ever known." End quote. Speaking of the younger Rockefeller, he remarked to the writer one day in the middle of a golf game, apropos of nothing that had previously been said, quote, "My greatest fortune in life has been my son." Part 2. Critics have frequently charged that Mr. Rockefeller's benefactions were set up as a shield against public censure, in an attempt to re-establish himself and ward off the abuse to which, over many years, he was subjected. Oh, poor Mr. Rockefeller being abused for many years. But this contention is not borne out by the facts. And we got a footnote. The legend, which has long persisted that Ivy Lee, the Public Relations Counsel, advised Mr. Rockefeller to create the various Rockefeller philanthropies as a method of establishing himself in public esteem, has no basis in fact. Mr. Lee did not become associated with the Rockefeller interests until 1914, 13 years after the founding of the Rockefeller Institute, 11 years after the General Education Board came into existence, and over a year after the Rockefeller Foundation finally received its charter. So there you have it. The famous Ledger A, which he kept in his teens when he secured his first job as a clerk in Cleveland, a job which paid him $6 a month, shows that he gave away 6% of his total wage to the Sunday school and various missions related to his church interests. The obligation to give was an inseparable part of his religious conviction. It was a philosophy with which he had been indoctrinated by his mother from his earliest youth. From the beginning, he declared, "I was trained to work, to save, and to give." 5 years later, in 1860, his gifts were rising proportionally with his income, which was still, however, small. Moreover, his plan of giving had broadened. Although his interests were centered primarily in the activities of the Baptist Church, by this time he was making contributions to a Methodist church, a German Sunday school, a Negro church, and Catholic orphans. In 1865, when he was 26 years old, his annual gifts mounted to $1,012. 4 years later, they reached nearly $6,000. As Mr. Nevins says in his biography, Mr. Rockefeller had not waited to grow rich before he began giving. It is to be noted that save for 1 year, his gifts constantly grew larger, and that by the later 60s, he was giving considerable lump sums, $558 to Denison University, for example. In his early giving, as later in life, he freely crossed lines of creed, nationality, and color. But there were other forces aside from his own ingrained habit of giving that were pressing on Mr. Rockefeller. By the turn of the century, the Industrial Revolution had swept the nation. Rapid expansion of industry due to the advancement of science, wide application of machinery, centralized financing, and large-scale operations had created a booming prosperity. It was the culmination of an age of economic laissez-faire, of uninhibited business practices which rolled up colossal fortunes and rewarded aggressiveness and acquisitiveness with wealth and power. Sorry, I just paused there because I think aggressiveness and acquisitiveness is probably the first two accurate words we've read to describe this family. Mr. Rockefeller, then and later... No, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't dismiss all this. I'm sure he had some good qualities. Mr. Rockefeller, then and later, found himself in company with men like Carnegie, Morgan. So Morgan, J.P. Morgan, they featured in the Lusitania book that we read. And then Carnegie, I don't know so much about, actually, but I think Carnegie had a huge influence on the education system in America as well. Carnegie, Morgan, Stanford, Armour, Sage, Guggenheim, McCormick, Havemeyer, Bamberger, Huntington, Rosenwald, Duke, and a dozen others who faced the same problem of the responsibilities and duties imposed by the unexpected weight of their fortunes. I love it. I love it. This guy's just getting abused, and now he's got to deal with this. Oh, it must be terrible having to deal with the unexpected weight of fortune. Beginning around 1900 and continuing for a quarter of a century, this group made a contribution to American life of which the impact and consequences are impossible even yet to measure. Acquiring their fortunes under conditions unique in the history of the country, and not infrequently by methods which, if permissible at the time, no longer accord with social conscience or the requirements of law. They enriched the intellectual and cultural life of America with a stream of universities, foundations, institutes, libraries, and endowments without parallel in any other age. So that is another pretty important admission here. We'll just go back and acquiring their fortunes under conditions unique in the history of the country and not infrequently by methods which, if permissible at the time, no longer accord with social conscience or requirements of law. So basically, they did things which were unethical, immoral, and broke the law as it stood at the time of writing this. So a pretty important little admission. Their motives were doubtless many and varied. Genuine social vision, religious principle, sometimes in part a desire for social recognition or the perpetuation of a name. Mr. Rockefeller, writing in 1909, said, "As I study wealthy men, I can see but one way in which they can secure a real equivalent for money spent, and that is to cultivate a taste for giving when the money will produce an effect which will be a lasting gratification." End quote. Mr. Rockefeller's position was undoubtedly influenced by Mr. Carnegie And actually, is it Carnegie or Carnegie? I've heard people pronounce it Carnegie. I think Andrew Carnegie pronounced it Carnegie as well, which I can't quite get used to. But Mr. Rockefeller's position was undoubtedly influenced by Mr. Carnegie, whose essay on The Gospel of Wealth appeared in the North American Review in 1889. Its thesis was the pithy aphorism, quote, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." Or, as Mr. Carnegie elaborated it, quote, "The day is not far distant when the man who dies leaving behind him millions of an available wealth..." What? Yeah, sorry. "The day is not far distant when the man who dies leaving behind him millions of available wealth, which was free for him to administer during his life, will pass away unwept, unhonored, and unsung," end quote. One of the most cordial letters of congratulation which Mr. Carnegie received came from Mr. Rockefeller. Quote, "I would that more men of wealth were doing as you are doing with your money," he wrote. "But be assured, your example will bear fruits, and the time will come when men of wealth will more generally be willing to use it for the good of others," end quote. I just don't get this. Like, it's a contradictory. It's like he amassed this incredible, unbelievably huge fortune, and at the same time he was super generous and gave everything away and believed in not having any wealth at the time of his death. It's just like contradictory characteristics, isn't it? It doesn't add up. Mr. Rockefeller's point of view was frankly expressed in the principle which he repeatedly enunciated, quote, "A man should make all he can and give all he can," end quote. But with his wealth accumulating so rapidly, how could he give effectively and efficiently? For this was the invariable test by which Mr. Rockefeller always judged his contributions. Indiscriminate giving he abhorred. During the 80s, before Mr. Gates joined him, he had arrived at certain general principles which he endeavored to follow in his contributions. His money should be given to work already organized and of proven worth. It should be work of a continuing character, which would not disappear when his gifts were withdrawn. The contributions, where possible, should be made on conditional terms so as to stimulate contributions by others. And finally, and to Mr. Rockefeller most important, his money should make for strength rather than weakness, and should develop in the beneficiary a spirit of self-reliance. Well, if that's true and that's what he believed, I think at some point his foundation got a bit off track. I can't say that in this day and age we're experiencing more self-reliance, more strength than people used to have. But he was not content. He was giving to a multiplicity of small causes, mostly related to his church interests, schools, hospitals, and missions. The scope obviously was not big enough for his rapidly accumulating fortune, nor was it broad enough to satisfy his growing awareness of social needs. Mr. Gates, who knew him better than most men did, and who was a shrewd judge of character, described him in these words, quote, "He had a taste for excellence and even for perfection in whatever he did. A taste so marked, so dominant as to amount to a passion, and it was indeed the ruling passion of his life. If genius is the art of taking pains, then Mr. Rockefeller was a genius." "I had a great talk with Mr. Rockefeller," Gates wrote to Dr. Harper in 1891, when the latter was selecting his faculty for the University of Chicago, quote, "And he wished me to say to you positively that the best men must be had," end quote. It was this passion for excellence which Mr. Rockefeller brought so conspicuously to the founding of his philanthropic trusts. Okay, I'm just going to pause there before we do part 3 of this chapter because I need a bit of a swig of coffee. I'll have a look at the chat as well. Oh, you didn't hear the dogs. That's good. There was a dog outside barking just non-stop there. Angry dogs. Hello from Canada. Mindhack. What's going on, man? Mindhack has an Instagram, and we share book quotes and book recommendations back and forth on there regularly. So worth having a look at. Feel free to pop it in the chat if you want to. This is all about books. And I think it's good to share anybody who's got the same enthusiasm and recognition that books are really what is going to save civilization, if anything is, at this point. So we're getting this picture of John D. Rockefeller Sr. You know, he just couldn't spend his money. He just couldn't give it away, his money fast. It was like almost like a curse. Like, oh, this poor fella, he's just got so much money, and his money just keeps growing and growing and growing, and he just can't give it away fast enough. So philanthropist. Oh, philanthropath. That's the new word that I've seen going around in a few different places. Philanthropath. So I think this is a kind of combination between a psychopath and a philanthropist. All right, so we've got about 7 pages left. I'm going to crack on and then wrap this first reading up, I think. Hope you're doing well out there. Thank you for joining. We've got 14 people on the stream. Wow, that's so cool. Okay, let's get back to it. Part 3. Mr. Gates joined forces with Mr. Rockefeller in 1892. Quote, about the year 1890, said Mr. Rockefeller, I was still following the haphazard fashion of giving here and there as appeals presented themselves. I investigated as I could and worked myself almost to a nervous breakdown in groping my way without sufficient guide or chart through this ever-widening field of philanthropic endeavor. This is amazing. So he almost had a nervous breakdown because he was so dedicated to giving his money away, and it was causing him so much pain and strife and struggle. Mr. Gates so completely changed this system that 25 years later, I didn't expect this book to be so funny. Mr. Gates so completely changed this system that 25 years later, Mr. Rockefeller referred to him as the guiding genius in all our giving. Says Mr. Gates, I gradually developed and introduced into all his charities the principles of scientific giving, and he found himself in no long time laying aside retail giving almost wholly and entering safely and pleasurably into the field of wholesale philanthropy. End quote. To illustrate the point, Mr. Gates described what Mr. Rockefeller had been doing for the Baptist missionaries abroad. Quote, he had conducted a small foreign mission society, if I may so call it, of his own. He was in daily receipt of appeals from individual Baptist missionaries in every region of Baptist missionary endeavor. His office, his house, his table was beset with returned missionaries, each comparatively ignorant of all fields but his own. We cut off every one of these private missionary appeals. We referred every applicant straight back to the missionary executives in Boston. Mr. Rockefeller then gave not thousands, as formerly, but hundreds of thousands, every dollar of which was expended by the experienced board. Mr. Gates had come to Mr. Rockefeller's office from the American Baptist Education Society, of which he had been the administrative head. Already the two of them had worked in close cooperation in Mr. Rockefeller's first great adventure in giving, the creation of the University of Chicago. Indeed, it was in the initiation of this project that Mr. Gates first came to Mr. Rockefeller's attention. Starting as an idea for a Baptist institution of higher learning under Baptist auspices and control, it developed during the 21 years of Mr. Rockefeller's active interest into one of the great universities of the country. When in 1910 he made his final gift to the institution and withdrew from all association with it, his total contribution had amounted to $35 million. In a minute, that's probably not far off $1 billion in today's money. In a minute adopted at this time by the trustees of the university occurred this significant paragraph. Quote, we know of no parallel in the history of educational benefaction to gifts so munificent bestowed upon a single institution of learning. But unique as they are in amount, they are still more remarkable for the spirit in which they have been bestowed. Mr. Rockefeller has never permitted the university to bear his name, and consented to be called its founder only at the urgent request of the Board of Trustees. He has never suggested the appointment or the removal of any professor. Whatever views may have been expressed by members of the faculty, he has never indicated either assent or dissent. He has never interfered directly or indirectly with that freedom of opinion and expression which is the vital breath of a university. but has adhered without deviation to the principle that, while it is important that university professors in their conclusions be correct, it is more important in their teaching they be free. End quote. I actually like the sound of this guy. I think he's doing good stuff. Maybe it was his son and his son studying at the LSE, London School of Economics, that when all the really bad stuff got started. We'll see. Part 4. Mr. Gates' passion to accomplish some great and far-reaching benefits to mankind revealed itself at an early date in the field of medical research. Starting on his summer holiday in 1897, he took with him William Osler's massive Principles and Practice of Medicine, a 1,000-page volume which had been published 6 years before. The retarded development of medicine, which the book revealed, stirred his imagination, and he returned to his office in New York fired with the idea that an institute for medical research established on a permanent basis, where groups of competent men would have opportunity on ample salaries for uninterrupted scientific inquiry, was the answer to the challenge which he read in Osler's book. As was his custom, when he had an idea like this, he presented it to Mr. Rockefeller in a vigorously written memorandum. While the suggestion appealed both to Mr. Rockefeller and to his son, it took time to mature. Careful preliminary studies were made both in America and abroad, and conferences were held and leading medical men across the country. It was not until 1901 that the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research was launched in a building on Lexington Avenue in New York, with a pledge from Mr. Rockefeller of $20,000. $20,000 a year for 10 years. Dr. William H. Welch of Johns Hopkins was chosen president, and on the board, and that Johns Hopkins, we should probably not. I shouldn't be advertising this company, should I? I don't buy any of my books there anymore. Johns Hopkins, that's an organization would be good to learn more about and know more about, because they feature quite heavily, don't they, in the pushing of today's allopathic medical paradigm. On the board were distinguished leaders of American medicine like Dr. L. Emmett Holt, Dr. T. Mitchell Prudden, and Dr. Herman M. Biggs. The following year, Dr. Simon Flexner, professor of pathology at the University of Pennsylvania, was persuaded to join the staff as director. Now, is Dr. Simon Flexner anything to do with the Flexner Report? Something to look into there. And this story about Ivy Lee is something else I want to look into. The modest beginning of the Institute, characteristic of Mr. Rockefeller's caution, was soon followed by a series of contributions which established the Institute as one of the great centers of medical research in the world. During the time that these plans were under consideration, another idea was being explored in Mr. Rockefeller's office relating to the field of education in the southern states. Growing from the interest in Negro education of men like Robert C. Ogden and William C. H. Baldwin, it soon enlisted a few outstanding leaders in both the North and South, among whom was Mr. Rockefeller Jr. Interest in the Negro problem was a tradition in the Rockefeller family. Mr. Rockefeller himself had been brought up in the abolitionist atmosphere of pre-Civil War days, and one of the earliest gifts noted in his Ledger A, when he was in his teens, was to enable a Negro to buy his wife. I presume that means the Negro's wife, not John's wife. John Rockefeller's wife. Presumably he's not selling his wife. Thereafter, for many years, he made current contributions to Baptist Negro schools and colleges through agencies like the American Baptist Education Society. When Mr. Rockefeller Jr. joined his father's staff in 1897, the question of Negro education was one that was frequently discussed between father and son. Indeed, the son inherited the interest from both sides of his family. His mother's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Henry M. Spellman, had been actively identified with the Underground Railway, and Spellman College in Atlanta, an advanced school for Negro girls, had been named after his grandmother. It was, therefore, natural that the younger Rockefeller should accept the invitation of Mr. Ogden in 1900 to join his party on a special train that visited Hampton, Tuskegee, and other significant educational developments in the South. Excuse me. Had a bit of a tickly throat there. Tuskegee. Does anybody know why that's significant and that stands out? Tuskegee experiments, anybody? Where these group of people were deliberately infected with syphilis, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Slowboy Whiteboard in the chat. Hello, sir. Welcome. So Tuskegee, very, very interesting. And I'm a bit worried about this paragraph I just read, if that's going to get me get this video flagged. But it shouldn't, because I'm just reading from a book, not my words. Cancel Fosdick if you're going to cancel anybody. Stimulated by what he had seen, he called a series of private conferences in New York in which plans were laid down for an organization that would deal in a comprehensive way with the backward and baffling problem of education, not only colored, but white. We soon came to realize, said Mr. Rockefeller Jr. at a later period, that Negro education could not be successfully promoted in the South except as education for the whites was also promoted, end quote. In 1903, 2 years... So it's a shocking realization. Either you educate everybody, you can't just promote the education of a specific group over another one. In 1903, 2 years after the Institute for Medical Research was launched, the General Education Board was incorporated by Act of Congress and was started on its way with a pledge from Mr. Rockefeller of $1 million to be used during a 10-year period for a greatly broadened plan of education, without distinction of sex, race, or creed. Under the leadership of Mr. Gates as chairman of the board and of Dr. Wallace Buttrick, another Baptist clergyman, first as secretary and then as president, it proved to be one of Mr. Rockefeller's greatest benefactions. In 1907, shortly after Mr. Rockefeller had added to his initial gift sums totaling over $20 million, his son, writing to Mr. Ogden, made this acknowledgement, quote, "Whenever I think of the work of the General Education Board and the magnificent future which is before it, I always remember that its conception and foundation were to a large extent the result of the Southern trip which I made as your guest." End quote. Out of the incident related to the work of the General Education Board in the South sprang the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission in 1909, devoted to the eradication of hookworm in the southern states. In the course of his tireless journeys and constant canvass of possibilities in the field of Negro education, Dr. Buttrick was introduced to a zoologist and public health official who was profoundly concerned with the hookworm problem, Dr. Charles Wardell Stiles. The two men sat up nearly all one night in a hotel room, and Buttrick was so deeply stirred by Stiles' description of the ravages of hookworm in the South that he rushed back to New York to tell Mr. Gates. Gates sent for Stiles and was equally aroused, saying, quote, "This is the biggest proposition ever put up to the Rockefeller office," end quote. With Mr. Rockefeller's characteristic caution and thoroughness, a year was given to a careful investigation of the disease, under the leadership of Dr. Flexner, verifying its extent and the fact that it could be cured and prevented. When the affirmative report was presented, a commission was established of which Mr. Gates was chairman and Dr. Wycliffe Rose of Nashville administrative secretary. To the commission, Mr. Rockefeller made a pledge of $1 million to be spent over 5 years. The project, when first announced, aroused some opposition in the South. The northern newspapers, unfortunately, played up the idea that one of the characteristic symptoms of the anemic disease was lassitude or laziness, a comment which was resented by the southern press. Where was this hookworm or lazy disease when it took 5 Yankee soldiers to whip one southerner? Asked a Georgia paper. And there were other remarks about damn Yankees holding the South up to ridicule. But under Dr. Rose's tactful leadership, the work progressed. And it was not long before cooperative arrangements had been made with the departments of health of 11 southern states. 5 years later, Rose was able to say, quote, "The medical profession and the public now generally recognize the prevalence of hookworm disease and regard its cure and prevention as an essential part of public health work in the South," end quote. 5. In the decade between 1900 and 1910, Mr. Rockefeller had had an illuminating and fruitful experience in the creation of charitable trusts. He had established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, the General Education Board, and the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission. He had proved to his own satisfaction that the most effective way of accomplishing the results he had in mind was to place funds at the disposal of independent boards of trustees, made up of the most experienced men he could find. Once chosen, these trustees were given a free hand to select their officers and carry on their work. Quote, "I have not had the hardihood," said Mr. Rockefeller in 1909, "even to suggest how people, so much more experienced and wise in those things than I, should work out the details, even of those plans with which I have had the honor to be associated." End quote. It is significant that he would not allow himself to be made a trustee of the Rockefeller Institute, the General Education Board, or the Sanitary Commission. And while in a formal sense he served for a few years as a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation, he never attended a meeting. So it sounds like he's just pumping the money into these things, and he's leaving the actual decision-making, the planning, and the running of them to other people. By 1910, therefore, Mr. Rockefeller was ready for his greatest venture in the field of philanthropy. The 10 years that had gone by were, in a certain sense, preparatory. And in that 10-year period, 3 men had been brought into active relationship with his affairs who were to have an incalculable influence, not only on the boards, which had already been created, but on the Rockefeller Foundation. Dr. Simon Flexner, Dr. Buttrick, and Dr. Rose. No one can review the history of these enterprises without realizing what a stroke of fortune it was that linked up the ability and vision of these 3 extraordinary men to the work which Mr. Rockefeller and his associates were launching. Other distinguished figures were to be added in the next decade, notably Jerome D. Green, George E. Vincent, Dr. Richard M. Pierce, and Abraham Flexner. But the initial choice of administrators was singularly providential. I need to just have a quick sip, excuse me. Throat's drying out a bit. There we go. All 3 came out of exceedingly humble circumstances. So we got more self-made men pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. Dr. Flexner was the son of an itinerant peddler in Louisville. Apprenticed as a plumber, he failed and was discharged. So he failed to be a plumber and went on to be a doctor. That's reassuring. After that, for some years, he was a clerk in a drugstore. With scanty preliminary education, he took a 2-year course in the Louisville Medical School and then, aided by the heroic efforts of his family, entered the medical school at Johns Hopkins, where he came under the eyes of Dr. William H. Welch, who had an uncanny ability for detecting genius. He failed at being a plumber. Dude, I'm not saying plumbing's easy, by the way, but do you have to be a genius to be a plumber? What kind of genius couldn't be a plumber? That's the question I'm asking. His advancement was rapid, and after finishing his course at the Hopkins, he went abroad for advanced study at Strasbourg, Berlin, Prague, and the Pasteur Institute. Louis Pasteur, father of the germ theory of disease, probably a familiar concept and question for people in this audience. And remember always that it's a germ theory. Returning, he joined the faculty at Johns Hopkins and then transferred to the University of Pennsylvania. Mr. Gates, years afterward, anxious that posterity should know by what inspiration the Rockefeller Institute was endowed with such distinguished leadership, wrote, quote, "I hope it may never be forgotten that it is to Dr. William H. Welch that we owe the priceless suggestion that Dr. Flexner be made the director," end quote. With a preliminary education almost as sketchy as Flexner's, Dr. Buttrick, who became one of the great educational statesmen of his generation, served for 5 years as a brakeman and a postal clerk on a railway in northern New York, where he had been born. In his late 20s, at the urging of his wife, he entered the Rochester Theological Seminary. Quote, "I was scarcely literate," he used to say, laughingly in later years, although the statement, obviously, was wide of the mark. After graduating from the seminary, he served for 20 years in pastorates in New Haven, St. Paul, and Albany. During this period, he was elected to the executive board of the American Baptist Education Society, where he met Mr. Gates. And later, he became a member of the board of the American Baptist Home Mission Society, which had in its charge the Baptist schools for Negroes in the southern states. It was Gates who introduced him to Mr. Rockefeller and who selected him to take over the administration of the newly formed General Education Board in 1903. It was Dr. Buttrick who chose Dr. Rose to run the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission. Why the choice fell on Rose, or by what intuitive process Buttrick saw in him the making of great leadership in the field of public health on a global scale, cannot now with any degree of accuracy be answered. For Rose was not an MD. He was a professor of philosophy at Peabody College who lived with Kant and Hegel, and who, at the end of his career, could write, quote, "My intellectual life began with my first contact with Aristotle and Plato. I still read them with the thrill of those early years," end quote. These were the men who blazed the trail in the development of the Rockefeller boards. So you've got a failed plumber, you've got a self-proclaimed scarcely literate theological enthusiast, and then you've also got some dude who likes reading Aristotle and Plato. What could go wrong? And also, I noticed that earlier, this Dr. Buttrick, I think he's the guy who's really interested in the Negro problem, as it said earlier in the book. That's a quote, by the way. That's not my words. In temperament and approach, they were as different as three men could possibly be. Flexner was first and foremost a scientist who lived for science. His slight build, his soft voice, his gentle manner were all in striking contrast to the steely precision of his reasoning. His mind was like a searchlight that could be turned at will on any question that came before him. He was incisive, exact, cautious, diffident, and just a little afraid of adjectives. Buttrick, on the other hand, was no scholar, but a man of sturdy judgment and massive common sense. There was an earthy tang about him, and his laughter rang through the corridors of his offices. He loved people and absorbed ideas not from books, but from contacts. He had a solid kind of wisdom, enforced by manifest disinterestedness and freedom from all prejudice. Utterly without ambition for himself, counting his friends by hundreds, he was big of brain and heart, with a quick and alert understanding that penetrated to the core of his problems. Rose was at home in any kind of intellectual field, not only because of the power of his mind, but because of its amazing clarity. When he finished speaking at a board meeting, there never seemed to be anything more that needed to be said. No officer in the Rockefeller boards ever submitted programs of work that were more carefully prepared or presented with more startling lucidity. He had a bold, fresh mind, with daring imagination and originality, combined with a practical sense of the immediately obtainable. It was always the new field that invited him. Progress. That's what he likes. He likes progress. It was adventure in terms of creative work that tempted him. And yet he was modest to the point of shyness and completely selfless. He wanted no credit for himself or his group. He took genuine satisfaction in anonymity. These were the men, and this was the spirit behind the new ideas that Mr. Rockefeller began to take hold of in a serious way at the end of the first decade of the century. And that is the end. Chapter 1 of The Story of the Rockefeller Foundation by Raymond B. Fosdick. So, I enjoyed that a lot more than I thought I was going to. I thought it was going to be pretty dry, numbers, facts, figures, dates, and actually it gave me a good giggle. So, what do you think? Hope you enjoyed that too. So it seems very clear at this point that that Fosdick is going to be giving us the kind of puffed up, heroic version of events where, like, he didn't even mention one bad quality about any of those people, did he, at all? And that's pretty significant there. So you're telling me all these guys he just mentioned and introduced who got to know each other didn't have a single bad quality or vice among any of them? They're just all humble and perfect and generous and passionate and loyal, and they just, it's crazy. And interesting that those three men, Rose, Buttrick, and Flexner, I found that account of how they all ended up being on the boards of these organizations set up by the Rockefellers. I found that pretty interesting because even he said, like, in the case of, I think it was Rose, he said there's no way to know how it ended up that Rose got hired and put into that position. So it sounds to me like a lot's being left out. What exactly was the nature of the relationships between all these men? Were there any, I don't know, secret societies involved? Did they have other avenues of getting to know each other, which are totally omitted and left out of this narrative? So that's kind of where I'm thinking. But good read, I think, very entertaining, and I am looking forward to continuing. But I can't right now. Got some other stuff to go and do today, so I'm going to have to wrap it up here. Peter says it was just getting good. Yeah, I know it is. So I'm pretty excited, and we got quite a bit to go. We'll have a few more good giggles, I think, as we work our way through this. So I think that is it for now. So what I'm looking at the minute, I'm looking at Wednesday night and Thursday night. No, sorry. Wednesday nights, Friday nights, Sunday mornings. That's the kind of rhythm of live streaming that I want to get into. I think it'd be good to have a weekly timetable so people know when it's coming up and they don't just get told 15 minutes before. So I'm gonna negotiate a schedule with my wife, and then I'll put that up. I'll put it into Telegram and maybe Instagram as well, and we'll try and get a rhythm going, and then we can get through this book and learn what there is to learn. And I noticed that it took us about 10 videos to get through Lusitania. This book's slightly longer, so we could be looking at another, I don't know, 30 hours or so to get through this. But keep an eye out on Telegram and Instagram, and I'll publish that information. So for now, thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and take care of your mothers. I'm going to add that in today as well. Even if it's not Mother's Day where you are, every day should be Mother's Day, shouldn't it, really? Let's face it. So yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much. Take care. And until next time, God bless.